It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar and to share with you my thoughts and some research I've conducted recently on the topic of youth violence. This is part of Brave's online dispute resolution expert package. So this is video number 3 of 4. Perhaps you've joined me for the other 2 videos. And this one, like the other ones, once you pay the registration fee, you'll be eligible to send in the quiz to Brave. And upon successful review of your quiz, you can add this training to your Brave One profile. So we'll get to the quiz later. It's at the end of the webinar as per usual. And don't worry, it's nothing too onerous. And the plan for this webinar is to run approximately 45 minutes to an hour, thereabouts. And I've chunked the material really into 2 major topics that I'd like to cover today. So the first topic then, we want to consider the different types of violence. I'm going to talk about violence in very general terms and then specific different types of youth violence, and that's helpful. For some, they may consider that to be splitting hairs, but I believe it's helpful to be very precise with our definitions so that when we are coming up with plans to intervene, we know exactly what type of violence we're dealing with. I want to talk a little bit about the prevalence of youth violence. This is a tricky subject. I track reports on youth violence on a daily basis, and certainly, let's be clear, there are many cities where violence is very prevalent. It's widespread, and it's very serious. Chicago comes to mind. There's been a lot of violent incidents there lately, and unfortunately, it's not necessarily a new trend. It seems that's had several years of violence in Chicago. But we need to temper that perspective about treating it as a serious problem and one that's widespread with considering local realities. And so I'll point to a research project that I did in the Canadian city of Ottawa, the capital of Canada. And I don't want to give too much away at this stage in the webinar, but one of the things we found conducting this research in Ottawa, Canada, was that the media can portray violence, youth violence, to be a very severe problem, and you know, they can. I almost want to use the term here that they over-sensationalize it sometimes. And what we found is that speaking with numerous youth living in the city, and speaking with numerous social workers and people from community organizations that deal with youth on a daily basis, we found that it's not, at least in that Canadian city, it's not as widespread as one might first believe if one went by the media reports. So we'll get to that. That'll be all lumped under the conversation on the prevalence of violence. And then once we've talked about different types of violence and the prevalence, we want to begin to look at what are the different causes of violence. And of course, if we have a good understanding of the causes of violence, that naturally leads to the next topic, point number 2, which is about practical steps that can be taken to prevent youth violence. So if you join me for my last webinar on peace leadership skills, you may recall that I shared a number of peace-building tools, and I said peace leaders are familiar with the wide range of tools at their disposal, and they know how to properly use the tool at the right time and in combination with other tools in order to create peace. And so that same thinking will be echoed in this webinar, where I'll present a number of very specific tools that can be used to prevent youth violence, things that could be used tomorrow morning or later this afternoon, they could be put into practice right away. And we'll talk about how one can actually go about preventing youth violence. So, the next slide here says, violence is the enemy, and the enemy is everywhere. So that's, again, kind of speaking to that mentality that I mentioned earlier about the prevalence of violence, that there's certainly one perspective that is valid that says violence is a very severe problem and it is everywhere. And when we kind of dig down deeper into that and begin to, maybe for lack of a better term, call this a typology of violence, or to identify specific different types of violence, we can see that it is prevalent in the sense that it cross-cuts through several different arenas or several different areas of a person's life. So certainly we can have domestic violence, and that's one type of violence. There's also family violence. There's youth violence. We have school violence, workplace violence, community violence, and we have to be aware of violence occurring on the international stage in the form of violent political conflict, which is kind of a rather long way of saying most wars are really about trying to solve political conflicts through the use of force or through the use of violence. So, again, just to help orient you, we are not necessarily looking here at family violence per se, or violence happening in the wider community per se, but we want to micro in on this idea of youth violence. And so what precisely do we mean by youth violence? And I share with you this definition that my co-researcher and I came up with last summer when we looked at the topic of youth violence in Ottawa, Canada. And we said, we will define youth violence as direct physical violence committed against people or property for any reason by anyone aged 13 to 19 years. So if you are a serious researcher or an academic on this topic and you begin to look at some of the scholarly literature, you'll see that different researchers have different ways of defining youth violence that meet the purposes of their own studies. And for us, this definition today works just fine. So we're talking about direct physical violence, like using force against anybody else or property. So that is, while we recognize the importance of online bullying and other forms of youth violence, they're outside the scope of this webinar as they require different types of interventions. So just to be clear then, I'm not going to be talking about school bullying, online bullying, even though those are important topics, but really we're talking about committing a violent act. So the cycle of violence, there's a famous saying that violence begets further violence. In other words, violence can spread rapidly. We sometimes see this with gang situations where if there's been a shooting against one gang, that leads to further violence as a retaliation occurs. So violence begets violence. This idea is not a new one. If you join me for my webinar on peace leadership, I spoke about Gandhi, who was the Indian peace leader from India. And we mentioned that he championed and he pioneered non-violent actions such as boycotts and whatnot. And one of the reasons that he chose to do that and to develop those techniques and to use those techniques was that there's a famous quote attributed to him where he says, "An eye for an eye leaves everyone blind." So he recognized in his wisdom that if someone inflicts violence towards us, if we retaliate with further violence, it doesn't really fix the problem, and indeed things can further escalate and spiral out of control, and what we end up having is this cycle of violence where the violence repeats itself. So, to draw your attention then to the first bullet point on the screen here, it says that it would seem that youth violence, as we defined it earlier on our last slide, is a huge problem that is rapidly growing out of control and is present everywhere. While violence can and does spread through social groups such as families and communities, we need to be careful to not over-sensationalize the problem. So that's the point I made a little bit earlier in the webinar. One recent study of youth violence in Canada, I should add there, found that while national media makes violence out to be an epidemic, there are actually many relatively safe communities where young people are actually more likely to be harmed in other ways. Car accidents, suicide, workplace accidents, and so on. So my co-researcher and I found this as a common message as we were meeting with and interviewing different frontline workers who are dealing with youth violence issues. And they said, well, it's good and interesting that you guys are doing a study on youth violence and what causes it and so on and so forth. However, if you're really interested in the larger topic of keeping our youth safe and having safe communities and keeping people free of harm, you have to be you have to recognize the fact that actually, if you take a step back and look at the bigger picture, when you look at the statistics, youth are more likely to be hurt or killed in lots of other ways in that particular city where we were conducting the research. So they said, you might want to mention that, and you might want to broaden the scope of your study. So it's something for us to be aware of here, that youth violence, we have to be work from facts, work from statistics, be certain we know the extent of the problem and how serious it really is. And it's helpful to take a holistic approach where we look a little bit more widely and say, what can we do to protect young people or to keep them from being harmed? And so even, I've mentioned in this webinar that, we've talked about other forms of violence and bullying and stuff like that. And a really holistic perspective would have to address all of those things. Nevertheless, many hold that violence is a learned behavior that can be addressed. So there's a famous saying out there that violence is learned and violence can be unlearned. And one of the major classic studies that seems to reinforce that perspective, it's when some researchers were brought children into a room with a punching doll. It's called the Bobo doll, and it's like a big doll that you could punch. And in some cases, the children observed adults punching this doll and then leaving the room. And for the children that observed the adults treating the doll in that behavior, those children were more likely to repeat that violent behavior to the doll themselves when the adult left the room. And the flip side of that is that sometimes the adults would be in the room with the doll and the child, and they wouldn't be violent or aggressive towards it, and then when they would leave the room, the child would not be aggressive as well. So the researchers concluded that social learning, copying role models, copying adult behavior is a huge determinant in causing violence. And that, so demonstrating nonviolence can be effective in preventing violence from occurring. So in other words, living in a nonviolent world is a real possibility if we can take appropriate actions to prevent and reduce youth violence. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that, if you joined me for my Peace Leader webinar, I talked about peace leaders providing hope and inspiration to others. And sometimes people see a problem like violence and they throw their hands up in the air and they say, well, look, this is too big of a problem. There's nothing I can do about it. And if you want to give people hope, you can say, well, no, this is a serious problem. People get hurt, people get killed. However, if we're realistic about what can be done, we have to recognize that we don't have to live with the violence. If we can convince people to take different actions or behave differently or treat each other differently, then a nonviolent community, a nonviolent world is a real possibility. So the next slide is titled Causes of Violence, and I've kind of already alluded to some of this in my last slide, where I talked about social learning theory and the idea that little children are a lot like sponges in some ways, and they soak up and take cues from adults and role models and other people around them. So clearly, if we are to prevent and reduce youth violence, we must understand what causes it. So when we look at the causes of violence, there's an important distinction that we can make between what we might call the root causes versus the proximate causes. And if you're not comfortable with that kind of terminology, you could think of it as the root causes that combine with the triggering events. So let me explain this a little bit more on my next slide. On the left side, we've got what we would call the proximate causes, and there's a number of bullet points listed there. And on the right side, we've got the root causes. So the root causes are deep causes that are deeply embedded either within people or within social structures and systems and patterns of behavior and cultures. So that's why they're the root. They are therefore harder to address, and hopefully that'll become evident when we look at the list of these behaviors or these causes. And proximate causes, what happens is they combine with root causes, and again, keeping in mind that the proximate causes are also considered triggers. It's like if someone has the root causes present, and then a triggering cause also becomes present, then the chances of violence will increase. So let's take a look at each of these lists. So root causes are deeply embedded ones. Weak parent-child attachment, the overall family environment, parenting behavior, which I should put in brackets behind that, is often passed down generationally, so that the way I parent my children is based on how I was treated by my own parents. So there's a generational aspect to that. Genetic predispositions, chronic poverty and unemployment, structural inequality, such as being oppressed or having your rights violated because of deep structural factors, and then my own personal, deeply held personal values that have developed over the course of my life, and I can hold either peaceful personal values or violent personal values. And we're going to keep that one in mind, flag that one, because we're going to talk about that one in greater detail in an upcoming slide. So root causes, hopefully scanning through that list, you're seeing how these are things that are very deeply ingrained in a person or the world around a person, and how it's very difficult to make changes to these things. Like, let's just take the example of parenting behavior, for example. Like I mentioned, the parenting style that I might use with my children is the result of having, 20, 30, or 40 years of how my parents treated me. So you can imagine how difficult, if you wanted to work with that one particular possible cause of violence, how difficult it could be to make a deep and lasting change with someone, because this is their way of being. This is their way of reacting to situations. This is just the way they don't know how to do things differently. So in fact, a friend and colleague of mine specializes in working with parents as a parent coach, and she recently was telling me all about her work and how a lot of it can be educational, a lot of it can be problem solving, and so on and so forth, and that it takes a lot of effort to make changes there, and really that's kind of building peace at the family level. Okay, so I don't want to get too far off track here, but I just wanted to kind of reinforce the point that scanning through that list of root causes, you can see that these are things that are difficult, if not impossible, to change. For example, genetic predisposition. There's very little we can do to really change our genetic code, our patterns and genetic coding, and so on and so forth. Okay, so those are the root causes. Let's direct our attention then to the left side of the screen and our proximate causes, again, keeping in mind that these are what we might call the triggering events. So here we've got the economic stress, which is kind of a short-term thing that can come and go. It's a factor that's out of our control. Association with delinquent peers. Access to guns and weapons. So again, there are steps that can be taken to create, zero weapon zones and violence-free zones and security things and whatnot to address that proximate cause. Substance abuse and or addictions, gang influence, and then various different negative peer pressures. So you can see then, let's take an example of how we can combine a root cause with a proximate cause and predict that violence is likely to happen. So if you are working with a young person who has a family environment that seems conducive to violence, maybe there's an absent parent or a violent parent, so then you've got the factor of parenting behavior, and then you've got maybe one of the parents, because of their violence, is unemployed or something like that. That creates poverty. So you've got 3 or 4 different root causes all combining. That doesn't necessarily mean violence will absolutely occur, but certainly I would say the likelihood is increasing at that stage. And then if you take a person who has all of those root causes happening for them and in their life, and you combine that with sudden access to guns and negative peer pressure and the appeal of joining a gang, then suddenly, the chances of violence occurring, I would say, escalate quite dramatically. So these root causes combine with these proximate causes and can lead to violence. And we're going to, later on in this webinar, look at a visual depiction of this that really shows this whole process kind of unfolding. So if it doesn't make sense to you at this moment, don't worry about it. We're going to take a deeper look. So the last thing I want to reinforce here when looking at root and proximate causes is that when you're looking at that list of proximate causes, I made the point before that root causes are deeply embedded and therefore harder to change or harder to address or harder to remove, whereas proximate causes, they're more surface level in some ways, and you can do things to address them. So, economic stress, if that's a factor that we want to look at or a cause of violence, we could say, well, what are some practical steps we can take to reduce the economic stress on this person or their family? And so that might be, having rent assistance or helping them find, meaningful employment and so on and so forth. So it seems like changes to those proximate causes are arguably easier to make. Okay, so on that last list of root and proximate causes, one of the things I said was that someone's deeply held values can be considered a possible root cause of violence. And this diagram is a way of visually depicting that. And so it's called values are at the heart of conflict. And so the idea is that deep within you are your personal values. These are beliefs that you hold to be true, ways of acting, and so on and so forth. And these develop over many, many years, and they're usually very difficult to change. And they develop from our values are influenced by numerous different things, such as our peer groups growing up, maybe being part of the church, the TV shows we watch, our family. There's all kinds of things that shape our values. And our values are going to determine how we use our power, because each and every one of us has personal power to some degree in almost any given situation. And I can choose to use my power for non-violent or violent means. And so if I choose to use power destructively, I'm choosing to use my power to inflict violence on the world. And the flip side of that is if I value peace and non-violence and other ways of resolving conflicts, then I use my power constructively, and I don't inflict violence on people. So you can see then there's a chain from beliefs, personal beliefs and values, outwards to violence. And so in that sense, violence doesn't just occur randomly or by mistake, but a person is choosing to use violence. It's an intentional choice based on our value system or our beliefs. And just to further hammer home the point about if we consider values to be a root cause, you can imagine that if someone had the value that, let me try to give you some examples. It's a dog-eat-dog world. If I don't stick up for myself, no one else will. Shoot first, ask questions later. And those are three kind of thoughts or beliefs or values about the world that I can have within me. And I would say that those kind of beliefs or values would cause me to use violence. And then the question is, how, as a peace practitioner or a peace leader, how do you sit down with a person like that and work them through those values and have them begin to question those values and whether they're serving their interests and whether they need to further develop non-violent values. And so that's an ongoing question that we'll be looking at. So addressing these deep values, there's a quote on the right side of your screen here from Dr. Martin Luther King, and this really, not only does it touch upon the notion of deep values and that values can dictate whether we'll be violent or non-violent, but he also touches upon this idea that violence is a cycle and violence can spiral, and if I react to violence with other violence, I'm just keeping the pattern going. So let's take a moment and read this quote. The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie, nor establish the truth. Through violence you may murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. In fact, violence merely increases hate. So it goes. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. So a very powerful quote, brilliant in so many ways for anybody interested in the dynamics of peace and conflict resolution and preventing youth violence. And it's saying basically that we're not going to fix the problems through violence, and there has to be other ways of addressing these things. So on the left side of the screen then, I've posed a couple of questions here for you, and I was saying, working with values, how might you do it? And I invite you to pause and take a moment to reflect on that and say, well, if I was really working with an at-risk teenager who seems prone to violence, and I'm concerned that their deep underlying values are making them more likely to become violent, what can I do with that person to really help them rethink their values? And so I've shared, I realize I haven't given you much time here in this live webinar, but if you're watching the recording of this webinar, you can certainly pause it here and maybe jot down a few of your own ideas. So I've shared just a couple of my own ideas here that I'm throwing down, and one would be, that there seems to be a lack of positive male role models in many communities. I'm the father of a young boy in my city here, and when I look around at the other male parents and the behaviors that they display and so on and so forth, I realize that there's not a lot of men who are displaying, positive, peace-oriented, non-violent kind of behaviors and problem-solving methods. And so I find that's a problem, and I think if you could model that behavior, then kids would pick it up. This links to the next one here. I've already talked about social learning theory, but this is, the idea that we learn by watching others. And again, so this speaks to the need to have kind of role models and leaders. So that links to this last idea here, peace leaders. So really all three of those things in that bullet point are very closely linked and reinforce each other. The last thing I would mention here is that I would consider looking at ways to help young people develop the courage or the moral courage to stand up and do what's right. And that means about developing integrity, and integrity is walking the walk and talking the talk. And knowing that if something's wrong, I'm not going to do it. And having a moral compass to guide oneself. And I believe that for young people who are still in formative years, and they're trying to develop that moral compass, and they're confused, and they don't have positive leaders to look up to help guide them, that what happens then is that the peer pressure can come into play at that stage, and they can be influenced either negative or positive behaviors through peer groups. And so if we're concerned about negative peer pressure, which was listed as one of the proximate causes on the previous slide, well then you say, how can we address that? You say, well, we need to find ways for young people to maybe become more self-assertive. So assertiveness training might come into play there. So this question of deep values and how do we address it is very complicated, and there's really no easy solution, but there's lots of different things that can be tried out. Okay, so this next slide I want to share with you here is from the Center for the Prevention of Radicalization Leading to Violence. That's in Montreal, Canada. This is a groundbreaking center in that it is definitely one of the first in Canada, if not the entire world. It's one of the few that exist in the world, actually, where the researchers and people working at the center are concerned about young people becoming radicalized through different ideologies to undertake violence. In other words, there's different terminologies here, and I don't want to scare you away, but they're talking about basically people who are becoming extremists, or what we might call in some other circles terrorists, and they might be domestic terrorists, thinking about causing harm at home in their own country, or they may be inclined to fly off to Syria or Middle East or somewhere else to assist ISIS and other terrorist groups. So this chart here is one of the most brilliant and useful charts that I've come across, and really this is a way of mapping out the whole journey, if you will, how someone will eventually choose, again there's that word choosing, based on their values, choose to undertake violent acts. And so it's very detailed. I'm not going to go through it all necessarily, but I would say this in a nutshell really covers everything. So they've really chunked it into three major stages here. So there's a bunch of stuff that happens on the left side of the screen where we could take early and primary prevention. And this is where a person is starting to kind of go down the path of making the decision to use violence. And we'll look at that in a little bit more depth in a moment. But once a person progresses through that early stage, and if primary prevention isn't successful, then they approach this middle stage here where secondary prevention can occur. And this is where you can see that there are protective factors and vulnerable factors that can influence a person to still choose to use violence. And then it's still not too late, even if someone is subject to a number of vulnerabilities there. Because on the third box on the right, we call tertiary prevention, and this is kind of where the final decision or process happens that leads to a violent act. So just in very general terms, I'm not going to look at all the details. If we go back to the very start, it's kind of like a map, if you will, or a flow chart. Basically, you've got different social and emotional circumstances and socio-political circumstances occurring there. So you can see things like economic vulnerability, precarious family ties, and so on and so forth. And then those can lead to a sense of unease that's either real or imagined, such as you can see there's a sense of discriminalization and a feeling of frustration and all that kind of stuff. So a person is starting to kind of not feel good with living together with other people. So it says at the very top there, the promise of togetherness or living together. So all of this stuff, these pressures and these factors, I would really relabel that, though you could consider those things as really root and proximate causes in some ways, leads to an overall questioning of whether, the promise of togetherness is something worth investing in. And then the person, it begins to search for answers. They're questioning, humanity, they're questioning these other groups around them, and so on and so forth. And as they search for answers, they're turning to family, friends, their school environment, mentors, the internet, and so on and so forth. And as they're searching for answers, the protective factors are at play, such as maybe they have empathy for others or tolerance. You can see those up in that list up there, critical thinking, and so on and so forth. And there's these protective factors affecting the person and their thinking, and there's some vulnerable factors. So you can see down there, there's isolation, there's impulsiveness, there's difficult life events. So the combination of these protective factors and these vulnerability factors are going to influence that person's thought process, and that's going to lead to them to come up with an answer of a question of whether they should use violence or not. So all that leads to the third box on the right, where they will either take a pro-social orientation at the top of the box, and they'll become engaged and they'll participate in public debate and they'll reject violence, and then that leads to they believe in the promise of living together. So that's kind of the positive path. Someone is going through these pressures, they're searching for answers, and they come up and say, I reject violence because I have, these reasons to do so. The flip side of that, if you look at the bottom of the diagram in the third box, is that someone can choose to take the path of taking a radical or a violent orientation. So they begin to legitimize the use of violence as one of the things listed there. So in other words, they say, harm has been inflicted against me, I'm going to use violence back at them, or we've had an injustice and now they have to pay for it and they're going to be punished. And so all of that kind of thinking helps to legitimatize the use of violence. And there's other things listed there, such as dehumanizing others, so clumping other people into groups that are not recognizing that they are valuable members of society, and so on and so forth. And all of that stuff is now feeding into an indoctrination process where they are picking up a particular worldview that might eventually lead on the far right in a kind of a greenish beigey box, it's hard to see that color here, into a violent act. They would either commit the act or encourage the act. So if you want to look at this model in greater detail and read more about it and some of the thinking that led to it, you could Google the Center for the Prevention of Radicalization Leading to Violence, located in Montreal. This is available for free on their website. And just to echo what I said before, this for me is a very simple yet comprehensive visual mapping of how a person experiencing different root and proximate causes towards violence can either choose the path of becoming violent or choose the path of nonviolence based on the different protective factors and vulnerability factors that they're experiencing. And so just the very last thought then on this slide before I switch to the next slide is that, again, if we're talking about, well, two thoughts. The focus of this webinar is on preventing youth violence. So it's important to keep in mind then that according to this visual depiction of violence, even right immediately before the violent act occurs, you can still take tertiary prevention. So we can be thinking of prevention happening really, really early on or at different stages. And then the second thing I would note about this diagram is that not only can we be saying that prevention can occur at different stages as a person is moving towards violence or undertaking a violence act or encouraging others to take a violence act, but the diagram is really helpful because we can identify a number of actions we can take to help a person take the path towards a pro-social orientation where they reject the notion of violence. So if I was working with a young person who came to me or was referred to me or whatnot, and they were at high risk for possibly becoming violent, one of the things I would do is I would look at those protective factors and I would look at those vulnerability factors. And I would probably want to sit down with them for an afternoon and really ask them a lot of questions using open-ended questions and communication skills, and interview them and speak with them and try to identify, well, what protective factors are present and kind of how strong are they, and likewise what vulnerability factors is this person experiencing and how strong are they. And then from a kind of intervention perspective, once I got a sense of the constraints and vulnerabilities that the person's facing, then I would begin to try to bolster the protective factors or add more protective factors to the person, and I would try to reduce their vulnerability factors. So, if one of the vulnerability factors listed there is isolation, so if I said, well, I want to help this person by helping them become less isolated, maybe there's a group, a community group or sports team they could join. Maybe there's a peer-to-peer support network. Maybe, I would work around a bunch of practical things that can be done to reduce isolation. And then likewise, in terms of protective factors, I'd say, how can we add more protective factors? And for the protective factors that the person already has, how can we bolster them so that they become more of a factor at play to help them on the path to a pro-social orientation? So ability to handle emotions, maybe that involves referring them to counseling or something like that. So excellent model, a great visual depiction and overview of how a person can move from experiencing root and proximate causes to having different vulnerabilities and eventually choosing a path of either violence or non-violence, and how we can intervene to prevent that at several different stages along the path. Okay, let's take a look at our next slide. I would argue, based looking at that last slide in particular, I already talked about, that you could refer a young person to a counselor. You could get them to reduce social isolation by getting them involved in sports teams and different peer support groups and so on and so forth. So I would say all of that really supports the notion that everyone is part of the solution to youth violence. So there's a quote here, and this is from our study that we did in Ottawa, Canada last summer. It says, because the root causes of youth violence cut across numerous sectors, geographic boundaries, and occur at different levels, such as the individual, the family, and the community, the solutions also need to be cross-sectoral and work towards addressing these various root causes of violence at different levels. In other words, hopefully you're familiar with the term holistic, but you have to take a broad, holistic perspective that sees the bigger system and the bigger picture, and you have to work in a very holistic manner utilizing a number of different professionals with different kind of backgrounds and experiences. So, we asked the people that we were researching what would actually work to prevent youth violence, and so we broke our respondents into two age groups: some younger kids and then some older kids. And for the kids that were aged 13 to 15 years old, here's what they came up with. Here are the things that we heard over and over again. More adult supervision, additional access to other activities and services which bring the youth outside of their immediate community, continued assistance from the city and other local agencies, increased police presence to help youth, which is actually kind of interesting because you get this idea that in some communities the police are distrusted and maybe not seen as always a positive factor, but for younger kids aged 13 to 15, they, at least in this community that we were conducting the research in, they saw the police as a positive, intervening, kind of stable factor. So they were saying we need more police presence. That kind of links to the next thing here: increased security measures in various different forms, such as more police patrols and cameras. And then increased support for different clubs, activities, and various youth resources, which fits in perfectly with what I was saying earlier about, referring a young person to help counter the social isolation, try to get them into clubs and activities. And obviously those things have to exist first in the community before you can refer young people to them. So that kind of all points to a funding issue, really. So let's look at what the older kids thought. So the other group of kids we looked at were aged 16 to 21, actually. So these youth wanted to see increased access to recreational spaces and sports equipment, increased and continuing services to youth, increased community involvement. So they were hungry and looking for opportunities to be meaningfully engaged in the community in which they lived in. Increased activities. So I would say the last two things really feed into the next one, which is about battling boredom. So how do we keep youth busy and engaged? And lastly, provide continued awareness and advocacy for youth community programming. So they don't want to see the programs that do exist, they don't want to see them lose their funding or not used, and so on and so forth. So very interesting research study. And then we looked for any key themes that were common across both groups of respondents, and a number of key themes were highlighted across both respondent groups. Notably, both groups responded that increasing activities for youth and facilitating community resource access are top priorities. So in other words, I kind of already hinted to this on the last slide, securing adequate funding for anti-violence programs is essential. So just to kind of embellish that point a wee little bit, one of the things we found is that there are young people who are positive and have great ideas and want to make a difference in their community and want to help their peers and all that kind of stuff. They are really natural born peace leaders in that regard. And that there are lots of well-meaning adults and social workers and parents and stuff like that, and that there are people with great ideas and they've got ideas for new programs and so on and so forth, but all of that stuff isn't actualized, or it can't come into being, or it can't occur unless we have funding. So in some ways, really, funding becomes an essential element of preventing youth violence. And I should note, I'm going to give a shout out here to the groups that we interviewed. They were doing some amazing work in the community, often on a shoestring budget. I mean, they didn't have a lot of funds for some of the programs that they were doing, but these were people that believed in it, and they were on a personal mission, and they put a lot of sacrifice into the programs and work they did. Okay, so I alluded to this earlier We've talked about it when we looked at the chart with the path to leading to violence. But we can begin to build here on this slide a number of very specific tools, solutions, and interventions. And I've certainly alluded to a few of these already, but let's take a moment to look at these. So, parent coaching, support, and education, peer support programs, peer mediation programs, employment programs and economic opportunities, in other words, job creation. A side note on that, I recently saw a news article where there was a major city, I don't remember which one now, said that one of the reasons young people were turning to dealing drugs was, of course, because of the money involved in doing that, and that to counter that, they were looking to set up meaningful ways for young people to make money in their communities. So there's a whole lot of interesting and creative stuff that could be done around job creation programs. Community policing, I've talked about that in a previous webinar. Donor assistance for youth programs, we just talked about that on our last slide. Substance abuse counseling, accessible education, youth drop-in centers where there's structure and positive role models and a safe space and so on and so forth. It alleviates some of the boredom that was mentioned from that research study. Youth sports and recreation programs. Recognizing and supporting peace leaders, I would say, be they adults or young peace leaders in particular. Anything to assist with trust building between different groups in the communities. Promoting nonviolence through media campaigns, rallies, marches, and so on. Creating zero violence zones and weapons-free zones. Unarmed civilian peacekeeping, which is an interesting idea. And then increasing security measures. So we saw that in the research results where the young people themselves were saying various different security measures should be increased to help curb youth violence. So certainly, again, there's no shortage of different tools and solutions and things that can be formed into an intervention that meets the exact context that you're working in. But again, none of this stuff can happen without some kind of money to make it happen. So again, it all points to the funding issue, I would say. So to conclude, youth violence is a very complex topic, but it can be addressed using a variety of tools, interventions, and solutions, customized to the unique root and proximate causes of the particular context or the situation in which we are working. So that's it. I mean, if you had to sum up the whole webinar in one big thought or one sentence, that would be it right there.